There are many possible futures. We'll get the one that we deserve. To help us dig into this, the final segment, it's people that are going to share with us why it's not necessarily all doom and gloom, the way that a lot of it's being portrayed right now in the popular press, that in fact, everything's gonna be all right. Shivon, Suzanne, Sinead, and welcome back, Fabien. So the purpose of this last segment is that the overwhelming narrative in machine intelligence since we did the first conference in 2015 has gone from a lot of curiosity and excitement and so on about the technology to, certainly over the last 12 months, an increasing focus on all the things that can go wrong. And the purpose of this is not to be dismissive of the downside. It's just that there's so much oxygen focused on the downside that we wanted to focus the last part here on what could go right. And the reason that's so important, that we think to build a future that is exciting and a much better future than the world we live in today, we have to be able to imagine it. If we can't imagine it, we can't manifest it. And so people on the stage working on various elements of the future, Suzanne in quantum physics and robotics, Sinead, who does a lot of imagining the future and education of technologies, Shivon working at Neuralink, brain chip. And so we're going to just go back and forth here on creating the narrative. What are the ingredients to creating a narrative of a world that we could aspire to? Let me just back up here. So just going to take this passage from Ken and then ask you to react to it. We live in a world surrounded by illusions, pursuing illusions. We think we have wisdom when we have none. We are so obsessed with chasing illusions that we've utterly forgotten what the real pursuits are. I could say endless things about our politics and how we waste energy chasing illusions and fighting over illusions, rather than going back to the few things that actually matter. So we're going to do this discussion in two parts. The first part is how do we think about what matters? So people working on the frontier, what is even a good outcome with machine intelligence? And then, so we're going to just abstract away from AI in the first part. Just what does a good world look like? And then part B is, okay, how can we deploy machine intelligence to get there? And so, Shivon, why don't we start with you, and then Suzanne, and then Sinead.
We'll start by saying that every little thing is going to be all right is a very high bar, but we're gonna do our very best here. But I appreciated the cheeriness nonetheless. I guess in the broadest strokes, when we think about society, of course, one thing we think about is just, again, ubiquity of resources, and I think humanity through the years has done a better and better job of using technology to up-level whatever that minimum threshold is for what humans need to survive and minimize suffering. And as we look to the future, I think on the bright side, we have the ability to do that in a very extreme way in terms of both digital and physical material ubiquity. We can get there. It's going to take a lot of effort, but we see obviously a lot happening on the software side, but there's a lot happening in the physical world side too. That means that with hard work, we can achieve a society where everybody has a standard of living that's a heck of a lot higher than it is today. I think one of the challenges that we have to work through, that I think we can work through, is, and Ken spoke about this, is sources of meaning. We both have cognitive sources of meaning, and we have sources of meaning that are just so evolutionarily hardwired into our systems. And some of those things rely on productive struggle and rely on self-improvement in order to actually gain fulfillment as a human being, just because that is what survived through time, is people who productively were able to do that. And so when I think about the future in the broadest strokes, those are the two things that I think about most.
So standard of living and enhanced meaning.
Yes, meaning and productive struggle within that, but essentially the evolutionary parts of our brain that we still need to satisfy.
And just so people, in other words, it's very easy to listen to this and think, these are abstract concepts. When you have a chance, there was a video published a few days ago from Shivon's company. And if you can just describe 30 seconds of that video, it is an artist who was in a car accident when she was 16, quadriplegic, and the first woman to have a brain implant from Neuralink, and is able to, with her mind, control the computer to do art. And certainly, it's only a 5-minute video. It's worth your time to watch it. But when I watch
I cry every time, but it's good tears.
It is what comes out in that video is a person who finds meaning. But maybe you can just give a 30-second preamble of what happened in that story.
Sure. So her name is Audrey. She was in an automobile accident when she was 16 that rendered her fully paralyzed. And so she went from being a teenager that was having just a wonderful life, had full freedom, had full autonomy, and suddenly the simplest things that she took for granted, just being able to get out of bed in the morning, being able to feed herself, being able to bathe herself, were suddenly taken away overnight. And so, when we recruit for the program at Neuralink, it's still an experimental device. We are looking for people who are very motivated by regaining meaning, both by bringing things back to their own lives, but investing in the future of this technology so it'll help millions of other people in the future. And so Audrey had that mentality, and one of the beautiful things is when she first got her Neuralink, which is, again, it's a fully invisible brain-machine interface that she got a short surgery to have in her brain. What it has in it is 1,000 channels that read the motor intent in her brain. And one of the wonderful things that happened was, she was just an artist. She was a creative, and she thought that era of her life was completely over. And so when she got the Neuralink, the first thing she wanted to do was just handwrite her name again. And so that was the first thing she did. She just wrote Audrey in cursive script. And it was a little janky the first time, but then as she practiced and practiced, the writing got more and more beautiful. And now what she does is she just creates beautiful digital art. We were also able to give her access to kind of the first generation of a robotic hand our participants are going to get to use, and she was actually able to put paint on canvas. And it's very beautiful. She's able to truly express herself. The art is gorgeous. You can buy it online should you want to support. But it was just such a beautiful thing to see this just core piece of humanity come back. You see the spark in her eye. You see the spark in her partner's eye. Just being able to see this woman who he truly loves just become more human again. And so it's been quite rewarding.
Thanks, Shivon. Suzanne. What matters in Ken's language, or something that a world we can aspire to?
So I think there's this thing we do when we do the Darby Mill podcast, which is take it to the extreme, what's the final limiting case of what we're talking about. So it's very difficult, but I think you have to step back and really think about what the purpose of life and what the meaning of everything is. And I think AI is now forcing us to really go there. And I personally think the purpose of life and the purpose of the universe is to explore itself, understand itself, and be curious and find new ways of experiencing that it's never experienced before. So this is outside of all technology, outside of all business, everything like that. You could even say it's a more spiritual viewpoint. And I think if you really internalize that, though, and then you start to think everything we've built in modern society, everything we've built in civilization are like tools to try and allow us to do that more. And even having families, raising children, it's all about bringing new forms of consciousness into the world that can experience it from different perspectives. And so I think the future is going to be really trying to understand the thing Ken was saying, this difference between intelligence and then consciousness. I think these two things are going to have to be considered very different. I think intelligence is a tool we have for extending, expanding, and connecting consciousness. And I think that is what's going to become really obvious over the next few years. So I think we have to think about the tools we're building, think about the new world we'll be building more from a consciousness first perspective than from a work and intellectual and intelligence first perspective.
Sinead.
I would say I think there are many possible futures, right? And I think Ken had talked about that. And when we think about what does it mean to make a good future, well, it depends on whose future you're actually talking about. So how we architect something that works is by creating conditions that allow for multiple, plausible, exciting futures for people, for communities, and for society more broadly. So when you think about the future as a design space with infinite paths people can take, and you architect in the freedom and the agency for people to pursue different paths, I think that's when you start to move towards futures that are mutually prosperous. And people are so interesting, right? So if you give them the tools, that's why I've stopped calling actually AI a tool, I've called it infrastructure. The technology itself is infrastructure. Put people on top of it and see what they build with it. And then as long as the broader ecosystem, we think about how do we make sure that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts and that it's resilient and adaptable, then you get something that works for everyone on the micro level and the macro level. So that's how I think about the futures that become possible.
And Sinead, have you imagined, and you described, okay, this can be used by many people for many different preferences. Do you have in your mind an image of one instantiation of what that looks like in terms of something that people could be a picture that could be painted for them today that some people would say that's the world I want to build?
I think Ken actually talked about it a little bit, and it's really interesting because I work with people and kids and young people that don't actually know the specifics of the technology, but they do describe a world in which there's a system that's very private, just for them, and it helps expand what they become and their potential, and they don't necessarily worry about things being leaked or things being shared. It's a system that becomes this mirror and this springboard. So I think that that's something that's interesting for people. I think in a very non-linear future where you get convergence with biology, and it's not something that we just kind of design in labs, but the future becomes things that we print in physical ways and we grow. I think that that's also an interesting space. We talk a lot about climate, and we're also building towards a world where we will grow buildings and we will grow different parts and things will self-heal. And I think that that's something that's also interesting for many people, and it solves many problems that individual people believe that exist, right? Climate, access, but most people don't know that that's what's becoming possible. And all of the futures together actually reinforce that vision, I'd say.
Fabien, from the chocolate factory, when you hear this topic, how do you think of it in terms of what does a future world look like that is either you can speak personally or from the perspective of Google that you want to work towards?
So it's interesting to ask a representative of a dismal science to be optimistic, but I'll try. 3 things for a nice future. So first of all, over the long run, technology has the best manifesto. More jobs and less work. Think of 1890 in the United States, for example. We were working 60-hour weeks, often in dangerous occupations, coal mining, things of that sort. Fast forward to the present, average working week, if you're full-time employed, 43 hours or so. And of course, a lot of people voluntarily choose to be part-time employed. We have a lot more freedom. So that's one avenue for the future. Secondly, we've heard about this on the panel already, healthcare. So the advancements of science we were talking about, Ajay is opening sort of room for longer, healthier lives. And do this thought experiment. Would you rather be a millionaire today or a millionaire 100 years ago in 1926? And bear in mind that $1 million then is like $20 million of today's money. I think you would rather be a millionaire today because the price of avoiding boredom and the price of avoiding death have radically diminished. So, Game of Thrones fans, what do we tell to the god of death? Not today, so that's becoming increasingly possible. And the third thing is, and Ken, you touched on this. So AI actually, paradoxically, perhaps to many, gives us the chance to lean into our humanity. It gives us the chance to reduce drudgery. One example, nurses in Tennessee at HCA Healthcare have used Google AI to basically help them with handoffs between shifts. It's a very important process to care for the patients, but it's very time-consuming. It takes 40 minutes on average per shift. And I mean, imagine it's 7 a.m., you're thinking about driving back to your kids to make breakfast, worrying about traffic, you still need to do that all-important handover. And through many iterations, they've gotten the system to be at a level of reliability that it's helped them, automate that. And again, lean into care for the patient, because people get into healthcare for the care element, not to do a lot of the red tape that is involved there. So I think we actually, if we play our cards right, have a chance to lean into our humanity.
Okay, and Ken.
I mean, all of my positive visions of AI involve the kind of user-centric control of data and of processing. That's very difficult today, just because it's so expensive. But it will not always be like that. I think a future in which we will run our own controlled hardware and to process our own model that's entirely under our control will allow us to do all kinds of things that's just not possible today. One of the ways to think about generative AI is to think of it as a way of mapping things. It is a way of mapping patterns in the world and then making predictions and allowing you to see patterns that are not otherwise obvious. I think the idea of training your own model and controlling your own model so that you can see in what ways you can improve as a parent, as a student, as a person, as a friend. The idea of these models allowing you to examine yourself in deeply reflective ways is incredibly interesting and exciting to me. And then finally, as an artist and as a writer, I think about the possibility of new forms of art or new forms of writing as a result of AI. Again, not in the sense of a lot of the popular sort of conception of it. So I'm thinking back to the way, again, at the beginning of Western culture, Socrates was supposedly extremely skeptical about writing as a technology. And the idea was that he said, look, the problem with writing is that it gives you the illusion of understanding when in fact you don't understand anything. People might read a book and they think they understand the ideas of the author. But their interpretation is entirely wrong. In real life, the way you understand something is through a conversation. You read something, and then you talk to the author about it. You ask questions. And then in that process of going back and forth, that's how you actually understand something. And for those of us who, when you study philosophy or any kind of sort of complicated subject, that kind of back and forth is essential to understanding the ideas of the author. So imagine that authors no longer have to just put everything down in a book and then just hope that the interpretation will be correct. Imagine you can actually capture an egolet of yourself on that subject. And now the reader will actually interrogate that egolet and truly get your entire perspective on it. Again, this is nothing like the crude versions we have today where you stick the book in there and tell the model to try to answer questions. That's not going to work. In order to do the kind of thing I'm imagining here, you would have to have the ability to capture not just the things the author has said, but also all the 10,000 things the author had decided not to say. You have to somehow have a model to be able to capture all of that. And then you can actually truly get to this ideal world in which you really are able to understand what the author meant. That, to me, would be incredibly exciting.
Let's turn to glimmers of hope. So in other words, each of you in your realm of activities have seen, some people use the expression, the future's already here, so it's unevenly distributed. You've seen instances of uses of machine intelligence that are a spark, and then you see that and in your mind you extrapolate and you say, wow, like if we were to lean on that, this could be very good for society. For each of you, what's something that you've seen that when you then extrapolate, you think, okay, that could be one of the planks to building an exciting future. Fabien, would you like to go first on this one?
I love that quote that the future is already here, just not evenly distributed. One of the areas that I tend to think about, people talk a lot about a world of abundance. I think about the music industry, which is already in a state of abundance. 1980s, you were growing up as a kid, you had cassettes, depending on how much pocket money, you had 8 to 10 albums, and you needed to play them sequentially. Nowadays, you have all the music of the world at your fingertips. Has that killed the music industry? It's doing better than ever, and it has not made it less human, in that it used to be the case that live shows were a loss leader in order to promote your record. Now, live shows are a sort of meaningful profit driver in the music industry, because while people have all the music of the world at their fingertips, they still want to lean into that particular Taylor Swift concert, that specific evening in Houston, which is irreplaceable. And so we are leaning into our humanity there. And remember, we've had the player piano, the automated piano, as an invention since 1894. We've never had more musicians employed across the United States and many advanced economies. So with all the technology, I think we still like being human and being with one another, and that's what I hope we will see more of.
And so
that's 2 Taylor Swift references. I think we have a fandom admission.
All right, Shivon, you're next.
Sure. I guess, my background is I came from being a VC focused on AI for good, and so I've been thinking about problems that AI could solve for society for a while, and I think the good news on my part, and again, it's going to take a lot of work on behalf of the society, is there are a few sets of problems that have just plagued me in the core of my soul personally, where I actually see a wonderful path if we get this right. And one of those is graceful aging. So it's always just kind of really struck at my soul that, you can work hard your whole life, and then towards your end of life, things start to fall apart. We just don't have the demographics to support a care model that allows people to age with dignity. Just because, again, it's getting worse and worse and worse. People are having fewer kids. The elderly are living longer. Just the math doesn't work out. But as we look to an AI future, there are a lot of things that are potentially enabling this to be a golden era of aging. So, we spoke about just the baseline of Maslow's hierarchy, just more ubiquity of food and shelters as a baseline. But then when you start to bring in the more practical elements of AI, things like pro-social agents or robotics, right? We had this first wave of internet and social media that I would argue is actually quite antisocial. But we are getting to an era where, about 10 to 12 years ago, I started writing about elderly care technology and looking for people building it. And I'd invested in a company 10 years ago that's just building a socially aware companion. Robot is a strong word. I mean, it has a little bit of actuation, but just to have presence there, to be able to connect you with real-world loved ones, remind you of things that you need to have in your life. And so that's kind of base layer. Another thing I think that most people don't yet appreciate is just how quickly the curve of advanced robotics, so humanoid robotics being just one version of this, their capability, their dexterous capability, the curve of maturity on this technology to be able to deal with use cases like working with the elderly or working with children is not as far away as we think it is. And compounding that is once we get to mass manufacturability of these humanoid robots, or again, whatever form they may take, they are going to be so much cheaper than a full-time caregiver. And again, it's not to say that we have to replace, there's just not going to be enough. And so to give something where there was nothing is massive in terms of living alone. And just to speak briefly about kind of more core medical technologies, I spoke about the Neuralink device, and right now we're helping people who are fully paralyzed or locked in with ALS, but people who've catastrophically lost function in their lives. And there's just so many examples of this as you get older, whether that's bodily function, mental function, or cognitive function. And we're working to a world, again, through devices like Neuralink that, there are existence proofs that we can solve many of these things, but also AI in the context of figuring out pharmaceutical interventions that can help not just extend life, but extend quality of life. And so I think one of my core hopes for a problem I've been worried about for a long time is that we will hit a golden era here.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Sinead.
So I tend to think in systems, because I think one mistake we tend to make when it comes to the future is we see it as an extension of the present, but maybe just faster or automated. But the future, it's inherently non-linear, right? We treat things as constants, the hospital, jobs, education, that are actually variables and design spaces. And so one of those areas, I mean, the hospital will probably just be a chapter of human history. There will, of course, be places that we'll need to go in the event of something acute. But the hospital is going to collapse inside of us and be something that we wear and hopefully never have to go to. And that isn't something that's fantastical. Just a few weeks ago, I was spending time with a scientist in San Diego. And there's many different versions of this. There's organs on a chip, there's brains on a chip, and he builds or grows brain organoids. So you can take a few of your cells today, maybe your skin cells, you can turn them back into stem cells and then coax them along to becoming brain cells. And then from there, you can grow them or accelerate the aging of those cells by taking them up to space. And then you can see what diseases your brain is at risk of over the horizon of your life, and then test different pharmaceuticals or engineer different vaccines or whatever synthetic biology solution you would need to prevent that. So imagine that across every different aspect of the body, the cell, the organ, and that's just one system, right? Can we design, we think of jobs in terms of, work in terms of jobs, but jobs are a really recent chapter of human history, and they came with the Industrial Revolution. We've worked for a long time, we've applied labor for a long time, but is the Industrial Revolution era of work the best model we have? Or can we do something different? Can we design something better? And the same would be from education. Is the factory model the best way to go forward? It worked for a particular economy, but we're going somewhere different. So I get excited when I see that the entire system is a variable, and so much of it is up for grabs.
Do you have in the job category anything in mind? In other words, the post-job,
like the post-job economy. So yeah, I do think jobs go away, but I don't think work does. I think the idea of jobs were a container that described a type of work, but because the system is now built on top of a system that learns and makes decisions, you can't possibly have a job title that would make sense 6 months later or 12 months later. So the whole system becomes fluid. I can start to see the edges of a system where we kind of plug in our skills and our ability to make decisions, and in the terms of the prediction machine authors, our judgment, to help solve problems and to help achieve outcomes. And that's a world that's much more interesting to me because it's not necessarily based on the assumption that seniority also equals capability, right? It's much more based on skills and adaptability and problem framing equals something different. And that's where I think innovation can scale in a way that it just can't in rigid org charts and with these kind of Industrial Revolution era assumptions.
All right, Suzanne?
So one thing I thought we could talk about is sort of cities of the future. So we think today everyone wants, the great, wonderful house on the waterfront in like a very amazing location. But one thing you could think about is why couldn't we have those kind of things in places in the world where they're not normally built? So people talk about terraforming other planets, terraforming Mars. I think we could do this by kind of using places here on Earth as like a starting point. So if you could take somewhere in the middle of the desert or in the middle of the prairies and turn it into a city of the future that everyone wanted to live in, I think this could solve many problems. So it would solve the sort of housing scarcity problem, because now everyone would want to live in these kind of places that were like utopian oasis places. And you might say, well, why don't we do that today? And it's because we don't have like the labor, the construction work, the resources,
it's not cost efficient.
It's not cost efficient to build, but as soon as the price of labor goes to zero and we can use AI in creative ways to solve things like supply chain issues, what's it called, like zero waste economies, circular economies, we can actually start designing these places. And so I just like to think about that as people say, oh, it's naive, it won't work because of this, and this, but it's just like fun to think about how you could solve the problem. And because I've worked in humanoid robots for a long time, everyone's worried about humanoid robots taking all the jobs, but maybe we need to think outside that box and think about what new things could we build that would need a lot of labor, like an army's worth of labor, construction workers, essentially people, if you like, going out there and building new things like that. And I think this could be a great way of not only improving standard of living here on Earth, but it's like a stepping stone towards terraforming on other planets too.
And I know that when you say that, some people will just think, okay, Suzanne's reaching the science fiction, but you were involved in precisely that project in the Middle East with the NEO.
Yeah, that's right.
With the NEO project, which was building a city out of
so
nothing.
So they tried to build a city in the middle of nowhere, and I think it has been stymied by all these problems we're talking about, not being able to find labor, not being able to get the goods there, and just the cost being prohibitive.
So for me, there's two things that I think are super exciting. The first has to do with interpretability. So Ajay, you brought up the example of AlphaGo, right, coming up with a move that no human would. And that to me is very evocative, because the real impact to me of new ideas like that is whether they can actually be understood by humans and actually expand the space of cognitive possibilities, or if they're just so alien that they stand out there on their own. And then so we're going to have to rely on AI to build on those kind of ideas down the road, and we're just never going to be able to understand what's happening. And I think that's why the interpretability is so important, to be able to understand how these models actually do what they do. I find that the interpretability work incredibly interesting, because they show ways in which these models function that are just not how we expect. And either this represents a new way of thinking and can change the way we think about things, or maybe they reveal certain weaknesses and certain fundamental limits in the way these models can work. And that will also be useful, because then we can figure out ways to push beyond that. So I think that work is incredibly interesting, and I love seeing new steps being made there. The other thing I think is important and incredibly interesting to me is the idea of craft in the way we use these AI models. So what do I mean by that? I think, as a software programmer and also an artist, I find it very interesting that software engineers react to vibe coding very differently from how writers react to generative AI writing prose. As a programmer, when I first tried vibe coding, I was initially very skeptical. But after a while, I was like, okay, this is actually really cool. I can imagine working this way. But as a writer, the idea of having these models write for me is just revolting. And I have never been able to get past that. And I was thinking about why the reaction is so different. And I think I know why. One of them is focused entirely on the result. As a software engineer, the thing that you're doing is just a thing for an ultimate thing that you want to actually put out there, which is the application. The thing that you do is not the point. The coding is not the point. The point is the actual application. So if you can sort of think about how to make an application without having to do that work, that is not necessarily a bad thing. Artists are very different. In art, the idea and the execution are synonymous. You cannot separate the two. If you're not doing that thing, you have not made that thing. Telling someone to make art for you is not making the art. That's the thing, right? So that's why there's such a fundamental difference here. And then I think this is where I think, if AI companies are interested in this is the direction they should go in. The fundamental problem with a lot of AI, in terms of if you're trying to do artistic work, is that there's no craft in the way you interact with these models. It's as though, in the days of photography, all you could do was to tell the camera, take a picture. That is not interesting to artists. Photography became an art only once the photographer could control the result in all sorts of ways: composing, framing, exposure, focus, so on and so forth. That's what's needed here. We need affordances in the way we interact with these models that allow us to practice craft. If you can actually give users the kind of control over how these models navigate the latent space, how these models actually generate the result. And you give artists the kind of control that allows them to practice craft. I think artists will start to feel differently about these models. Once you've ceased to feel like you're just telling someone to do something for you, but you're actually doing that thing, that's when all the interesting craft will come in, and that's how you're going to do interesting work. So that's the part I'm excited about.
All right, we're going to wrap up with a lightning round. I'm going to come to Ken and Fabien just before we do the lightning round, but so everyone can think about it. Lightning round here is just in a couple of sentences. We're at the University of Toronto. Probably the question that many of us get the most, more than any other question, is, I have a kid in first year. What should they be doing? So in the context of our conversation today, which is there are many possible futures, we'll get the one we deserve. If we want to help people develop the skill set to building towards the great outcome, what are those skills? How can they prepare as the next wave of the workforce, or the not workforce, the workforce but not the job force? How can they prepare to be the architects of that world that we imagine is possible? Okay, so in just a couple of sentences. While you're thinking about this, Ken, I'm going to ask this question for you, and Fabien, give you a chance to respond. You describe the ultimate AI as one where we have full control. That's not the one that Google's building. So are you imagining a world where there's a ecosystem of AIs, and there's the ones that the large companies are building, and then there's our individual? In other words, how does this coexist in the world that you imagined?
I come from the software world, in which the open source model was extremely important for pushing innovation forward. So yes, I do think that in the ideal world I'm envisioning, AI cannot possibly be something that's monopolized by one or a few companies. That's not a future that is in any way, shape, or form positive. It has to be a world in which there are lots and lots and lots of models at different scales for different purposes. Some open source, some open weight, some entirely under individual control, some not. It has to be in the whole ecosystem. And whatever our regulation is, it has to allow that.
I won't get into what the role of OpenAI was meant to be, but let's just let you have a chance, Fabien, in terms of the ecosystem of how Google thinks about this world of building very large models inside the machine, and then a world of open source and, in this case, individually trained models.
We have many offerings, and actually we have open source offerings when it comes to models as well. So our Gemma sort of range is an open source range. From an economist, I have no particular preference. Open source, closed source. What's important is that they compete on the market in a free way. If you think of mobile systems, for example, iOS, Apple's iOS, closed source, Android open source, they just compete harmoniously, let the better system win, and persuade customers. And in terms of what's happening with large language models, there is such a plethora of choices. And if you think of the investment that sits behind them, we probably are living through one of the most competitive waves in capitalism ever, with the only parallels I can think of as the electric current wars or the early automobile industry in the early 20th century. So it is a very competitive world. So we're very far away from the M word, the monopoly word that Ken used. So, let the best contender win.
Okay. All right. Let's go to, just imagine sitting in the front row is a first-year university student, 2 or 3 sentences. What can they do to best prepare to be a contributing member to the world that we want to create? Sinead, we'll start with you.
I would say if you're in first year, cross-disciplinary thinking is going to become really important. So if you have varied interests, maybe you're interested in biology, but you're also interested in history, that is great. Explore both of those things, and think of yourself much more as a bundle of skills that can solve different problems and be applied to different projects, and build simulations of the world you think you want to work in, right? Use AI agents and AI systems to practice what the future may look like, to rehearse the future, to rehearse the things the problems you want to solve, and then that's that kind of learn by doing method that I know you also reference as well. So that would be my advice.
One of the interesting things that you said in your description was to use these for the problems you want to solve. Mm-hmm. And buried in that sentence is want. And so in other words, do you think that one of the key skills is by the time you get to first year university, you've developed a sense of what problems you want to solve? In other words, where does want come from?
I mean, those would be the problems that you think you experience, right? I think it's individual to the world that you live in and the context that you exist within. But if you see a problem that you think you want to work on, and maybe it doesn't exist by the time you graduate, which would be even better, but that's a place where you can start to practice the application of your skills. And I actually think it's a much better way to think about the future of work, not in terms of what do you want to do, but what problems do you want to solve? Because the specifics of the workforce and the job, we can't really see all that. But we can see grander problems that you could apply your skills to.
So arguably, one of the skills that in order to do what you've described in first year is by the time you get to first year, you arrive your first day on campus having already developed a list of problems. In other words, rather than getting through high school and practicing solutions, you've developed a library of problems. It is as one way to think about the want in your sentence.
Sure, I guess that's one way to look at it, but I can see them as the same thing. So if you're thinking about a problem, you're also inherently thinking about a solution, or you're thinking about something that can be created. So if you think about it as the system, you don't just kind of stop at the problem and that's something for somebody else to solve. You come in with, how can I be the architect of the solution?
Fabien.
I'll quote you back at yourself, Ajay. You've said, with Joshua and Avi that, most decisions across the economy have two components, prediction and judgment. Prediction, AI gives us a super calculator, a prediction machine that you have talked about. It's essential that you master it, so become a master of AI, and there are very high returns to experimentation. But then the second component is judgment, which in my books is irreducibly a human dimension. So for a young person, acquire experience as fast as you can. Become that orchestrator that allows you to be the glue in processes, the glue across tasks, the glue in your organizations, and to bring that vision. So bring the technology part, but bring the human experience part to it as fast as you can.
Thank you. Shivon?
Very cleanly, if you are 18 years old today, what do you have that nobody else in this room has? You are AI native. None of us here are AI native. Everyone who's 18 today has had an intimate relationship with AI over the last 4 or 5 years in their elementary schools and high school schooling. They don't know a world without it. They think to solve problems with AI first before doing it a different way. And so that fundamentally gives you the opportunity to push way past where kind of like people in my friend cohort are, who are, they're learning to vibe code with and again, they're just creating slob left, right, and center. When you are AI native, you can be the next generation of true composer. And again, everything in the world is moving quickly. I don't know how long this true composer era will last, but if I were 18 today, that's what I would lean hard into.
When Shivon jokes about vibe coding and her friends, or her friend circle is Andre Karpathy, and so that.
Okay, I'll give him credit beyond vibe coding. Yeah.
Okay. Suzanne.
Maybe not for everyone, but I think a subset of people should really deeply study philosophy, especially philosophy of mind and metaphysics. Because I think with AI looking at, doing science for us, making new discoveries, I think our entire understanding of the world and who we are and our minds and how consciousness and physics and the universe work is just going to be absolutely turned on its head. So I think being ready for that, having studied some metaphysics, knowing that there are different ways of looking at reality than just maybe the one you've been brought up with, I think is going to be critical. So having being able to switch between multiple different metaphysical viewpoints, it sounds kind of weird now, like what am I talking about? But trust me, the kids of today are going to have to switch like philosophical viewpoints like natively. So
This was like Suzanne here 6 years ago saying, trust me, AI is going to be a thing. Ken?
So the advice given to young people often is to pursue your passions, but it's kind of useless as a piece of advice because there's no explanation of how to figure out what your passions are. And so my advice is, here's how you figure out what your passions are. Figure out what are the things that annoy you, and what are, of those things that annoy you, which are the things that you can realistically do something about. If you persist in coming back to certain things that annoy you and you can do something about it, that allows you to have a sense of satisfaction constantly. The reason why you're annoyed by those things is because they're important to you. And if you can actually do something about it, that is a recipe for doing something that you will constantly get satisfaction out of. That's what passion actually is. Passion is just basically being annoyed by something and then constantly trying to solve it. That is entirely why I ended up writing the books I do, because I'm annoyed by the books out there that tackle the subjects, that don't do it in the way I want to. So that's kind of my advice.
Just before we
Can we
wrap
put
here,
that on a t-shirt, please? I loved it.
let me thank Fabien, Shivon, Sinead, Ken, Suzanne, thanks very much.